Ms. Morrissey, I am so happy to have you here on Northern Vibe. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on.
Oh, Matt, it's my pleasure. Call me Di.
Oh, thank you. I just didn't want to be.
That's very nice of you. You've been a well brought up boy.
Yes, well, my father was rather strict on that sort of stuff, on the use of titles. Excellent. You knew Dorothea McKellar and Chips Rafferty. Oh my God.
I wouldn't say no. I knew them intimately. Chips I did. Chips became my surrogate godfather. Was there gave me away at my wedding and things like that. But I was a little girl living in this magical place called Pittwater, which is, sort of on the outer skirts of Sydney. And back then it was just bays and you had to get the ferry over there, and it was bushland and little fibro cottages, and that sort of people had that they came for weekends. We just happened to live there all the time, and my father ran the little ferry service. But then my mother always said, I used to go just wandering around in the bush, and she would say, no, you are not to go down the end of the bay, and there's an old witch that lives down there. So, she'd been glimpsed occasionally. She always wore a long black skirt and this funny old straw hat. Of course, the first opportunity I had at age 7, I went down and she had, Dorothea would, of course, loved nature, and she wouldn't allow the bracken or any of the yard area be cut. So it was, probably full of snakes and things, but all the bracken was really high. And so I went prowling around this garden. Anyway, she came out, she found me, and she's, very imperious she was. And she said, what do you think you're doing? So quick as a flash, I said, I'm looking for fairies. And she sort of looked at me, and she had her walking stick, and she said, what a splendid idea. I'll help you look. And she's lifting up the bracken with her stick. And then she invited me inside Tarrangower, which is this wonderful old house. I had never seen a library before. Books, my parents were very poor, and I got a book at Christmas and a book at birthdays, and it was a big trip into the library. So I had never seen wall-to-wall bookcases before. I was just gobsmacked. She said that, I said, you must read a lot. And she said, I do. And I also write a lot. And she said, I write poetry. And I said, oh, I know some poetry. And I stood up and I did Henry Lawson's Across the Stony Ridges, Across the Rolling Plain, young Harry Dale the drover came riding home again, So I said, I recited, she said, oh, that's very good, my dear. And I said, well, when I don't have books, I make up my own stories, which I did. And then she looked at me very, very seriously, and she said, that is a very, most people would, adults wouldn't consider that, but she looked at me very seriously, and she said, that is a very splendid idea. And when you grow up, you must put your stories in a book one day. And I went, oh, what a good idea. I'll do that. So eventually I did. I went home to my mother. I got into trouble for going down and bothering Miss McKellar. And I said, anyway, I'm going to write books one day. And my mother said, oh, isn't that nice? Go and shell the peas for dinner. I just so wish that Dorothea lived long enough that I could go back and say, you don't know what you did to a little girl, that when everything seems possible. And so I think I did have a gift. I mean, we all have gifts. I'd love to be able to sing or paint or something, but I know I can tell a story. I can make up stories. And so that's what I do. But you don't, leave high school and become a novelist. So that's... that was another journey. Chips lived across the bay from Dorothea, and he and Quentin, they never had children. And I used to row over, they lived in the city, but they used to come and stay. They loved Pittwater, and Chips used to fish. He used to walk around with a lava cloth lap on. He was quite a character. And the rumour is that Dorothea used to swim naked across the bay to go and visit he and Quentin, but I can't verify that. But so Chips became, a real wonderful influence, in my life. And he was also the one that said to me, because I said, I'm going to grow up and write books. And he said to me very seriously, whatever you do, you make it Australian. So I just felt that what I had about was Australia and our stories and our country, and again, timing is everything, luck is everything. So when I did write my books, which were very focused on Australia, the readers were ready too. We were sick of, all of the big famous American and English writers coming out here to the colonies. We all had bloody good writers here and bloody good stories here. So, timing. Television now should be, and the programs that people, the streaming, but I still think basically Australian audiences like Australian stories.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're kind of good at it, and considering that we've got a disproportionately Irish heritage, chaps like Nearly. What, why?
Yeah, but see, my grandparents were English. They came out from England, and they had, my grandfather was about 14, and they didn't have any money, so they came out, I think, on some old windjammer sort of boat. But what he brought he left school at 14, but was obviously a bright boy. But what he bought was his grandfather's books, which were all editions of Thackeray and Dickens, and all of which I still have. And so that love of reading, that's the biggest thing to instill in a child, the love of books and reading, which I fear greatly about now with, in my grandchildren are just screen time. So we insist that they read a book at night. We read to them, which we still do.
And look, that is so important. I've got to say we're pretty good that way with the Maloney's, and the eldest girl is a voracious reader. The middle girl is only slightly behind her. The boy is a work in progress, admittedly, but I think that's...
Yes, boys are like that. But my son was like that, but then he suddenly caught up when he was about 15. He suddenly then, found a subject he was actually interested in. And he's now an academic. He's a professor and teaches at the University of Georgia. So, there's hope, Matt.
Yeah. Now, many people watching this are or aspire to be creative. Like, as you said, people have that kind of spark within them. And they're interested to know how to harness that creative streak. So what would your advice be to someone who's...
Pick up a pencil and a paper and start writing. Yeah. Yes, you can go to creative writing classes and stuff like that, but essentially, reading is it's only between two people, me the writer, you the reader. So you don't that's why I try not to, when I started writing, I was trying to think, how do you appeal to such a big audience, and what do you focus on, and all of that, and basically you tell yourself a story, just do what interests you, because somehow then that will interest somebody else. There's nothing like, you can't try to manufacture interest, or if you just write truly what you enjoy reading. It's like a letter that basically it's reading is a relationship between you the reader, me the writer. It's only two people, so it's between us. So I put down on a piece of paper what interests me, and hope that you are going to be interested in that as well. And that's how you sort of make a connection. It's like speaking to one another, that then somehow or other that's a better way to sort of make contact, rather than everyone trying to think, oh, I'm going to write this genre and this, and I'm going to it's just easy. I always just think of it as just writing a letter to a friend. You'll never guess what happened to me when I came home. You'd say, oh my God, whatever. It's a conversation, and then it's funny how that leads you into other things.
I mean, that's so cool, because I've never done any creative writing courses or anything like that too. But from what I've read, and a couple of the little YouTube things that I've read, they've said, you've got to get a target audience and appeal to them. But it seems to me although you're not excluding that idea, there's a degree of...
no, my audience goes from 15-year-olds to 95 years old, including a heap of men. So, because my genre, I'm not writing, romance. There's a lot of culture, landscape, environment, history, characters. See, the other thing, because I was a journalist, and I really think, because as I left school at 15, and we were very poor, and my mother couldn't afford to send me to university. So my uncle, who was an ABC foreign correspondent, said, all right, what you have to do is you have to go and be a journalist for a while, go and work in a newspaper. So he took me into the bowels of ACP in Sydney. And then I became a copy girl, and then I got my cadetship on the Australian Women's Weekly, run by a group of extraordinary women. Absolutely, not just the best training in writing, being curious, asking questions, but it was ethics and integrity, manners. It was all kinds of things, which has stood me in very good stead, because I still work as a journalist, and these wonderful women said, "And my dear," because we are in the middle of the pack, the John Pilgers and types running around. These women said to me, "And remember, you get a lot more result with honey than you do from a foot in the door." So that's always stood by me. And also, you've got to have a genuine interest in people. I mean, wherever I am, I talk to people. I go, "Oh, so Matt, tell me, I don't know anything about you. Tell me your story. Where you come? Why are you living here? What do you want?" Ask people questions, because it all just sinks in. And at some point when you're writing, this stuff sort of dribbles out, and you think, "Oh, where did that come from?" But it's something someone told you a couple of years ago.
And it just kind of comes out subconsciously.
And the other thing that I do is that, having been a journalist, I can't bear the Googles and stuff. I go and live in each place for a month, because the stories have all come out of place. And, I went overseas and worked in London when I left school at 15, but I had never seen my own country. I'd never, ever travelled outside Sydney. So by the time I came back and started writing, what I wanted to do was, so I travelled around Australia and, fell in love with my own country. And then place became really the key for me. So each book's inspired by a particular place, which I don't put the pin in a map. It's something just kind of happens, and I'm led to a place. So I trust that, this must be where I've got to set the next book. So I go and I spend a month just living in a place, and then you get then you absorb the people's stories, the history, the culture, the colour, the smells, all of that, so that then when I sit down here, I can sort of shut my eyes and I'm back in Broome, or where Cape York or wherever. So again, the journalism skills have been really, really helpful.
So I know you love writing, but there's always a degree. Now it's kind of living. But what do you do to discipline yourself? I mean,
the journalism training. See, again, it was inconceivable that you would miss a deadline. I mean, I was on a weekly. No, I think the Women's Weekly was it was a weekly. It was a weekly. It's now a monthly. So that's a lot of material, and you've got to keep. So you had a deadline, and so you just wouldn't miss a deadline. You just had to do it. So you can't fluff around and think, I'm just waiting for inspiration to strike. You have to just punch out the words, and then hopefully fiddle around with them and make them a bit better, and then the subs take it and say, "This is terrible." And also you have to get the reader's interest right at the beginning, because otherwise people in a newspaper, they just turn it, the page, or the subs cut from the bottom up. So you've got to get that interest right at the beginning. And I think you find that with a book or a movie. You think, not liking this, and you turn off or shut the book down. So that was the journalism. So that's discipline. I would never, ever miss a deadline. And I set myself, a routine. I mean, I was used to working for other people. And then when I decided I had to write books, I quit my job and I came, and I used to think, I can wander around and I can go in the garden, I can do the washing. So no, I had to go and sit at my desk. And Somerset Maugham said, just write. Even if you're just writing your name over and over and over and over, sit there and write, type, print, write something. So, and once you start, then, and you're forced to do that, whether it by, a deadline or your own personal deadline, that you become motivated. And also, you know, if you've got a family at home, for a lot of people, time is very precious. So the time for you to be creative, it's very hard to do that at the end of a day when you're absolutely stuffed and tired. So my thing, I've always been an early riser. So, you know, get up at 4 or 5 in the morning, have that time to yourself. In 2 hours, you have a good start. So every morning, that's another thing to fit, you know, to juggle. I had the luxury that, well, I just walked out of my job. I was, you know, working in television, and I just went, I've been here 8 years. Whatever happened to the dream of, you know, writing a book one day? And so I just went in and said, I'm quitting tomorrow, Friday, and I won't be here on Monday. And I just felt, if, you know, I'm in my late 30s, I'm going to be 40, I haven't written a book, and what's happened to the childhood dream, you know? So you just have to bite the bullet, really.
Kudos to you. So that's the kind of principles. Now, going from 0 novels to 1 is the hardest. So can you tell me about the first novel, Heart of Dreaming? And I don't mean the plot and stuff like that, because that's, you know, that's all available. Like, what inspired that? How long did it take to write? And after you wrote that, like, how did you break through?
Well, I was really lucky that the book turned out to be a big success, because don't forget now, I had a profile. I had been working on breakfast television for 8 years. So I had kind of a, you know, a name. So that makes publishers happy. So I just quit. And then I was kind of inspired by, I was filming a story for Good Morning Australia out in, I was up in Longreach, where they were raising funds to build the Stockman's Hall of Fame. And they had, and R.M. Williams started this, endurance ride. So I filmed that and did a story on that for Good Morning Australia. But then sitting around the campfire with R.M. Williams and talking about the outback and the bush and a whole lifestyle that I, you know, was not familiar with. And I saw this woman the next morning who pulled up. Now this is, you know, going back into the 80s, and she drove up in one of these very flash 4-wheel drives, which were, you know, very expensive and a bit of a novelty in those days. And she got out with this sort of chiffon scarf and riding boots and immaculate moleskin pants. And I mean, like, she looked like a movie star. And she got out of the car, and I went, "Oh, who's that?" And old RM went, "Oh, she's a really interesting woman. She's a fantastic horsewoman. She runs a great big cattle property on her own. She's got a station, You'd like to meet her." And I just kind of went, my instinct then was to go, "Oh, no, thank you, no," because I thought, I suddenly had this vision of this woman. And I thought, if I meet her and, like, I just don't like her, or there's something about it, you know, I don't want to spoil the illusion. And that was the woman that I kept in my head as a Queenie character. So then I thought I would write about a station called Brolga Downs, you know, out in the middle of nowhere. So I stayed and went back. And then I spent a lot of time with friends from Glen Innes who, you know, are in cattle business. So they took me out mustering. You know, I had to go and live in the and work in the bush for a while so that was my form of research. And then I came back and I thought, now I've been working in television and I've got all of these sort of TV contacts. My mother was a film director, film and TV sort of in my blood, not publishing. So I thought, I'll write a 30-page film treatment of my idea, and then when it's a fabulous television film series, I'll turn it into a novel. And so I wrote the 30 pages, and a lady, when I was on Good Morning Australia, was opposite the studio in Channel 10, and she had a bookshop, and she was always trying to get authors on the show. When the producers never wanted authors because they were boring talking heads. So I was always trying to smuggle the authors on. So I became quite friendly with this lady who ran the bookshop. I ran into her. So I had my 30-page treatment, which has now been in the drawer for 2 months. And she said, "Oh, I've just become a literary agent. I don't have the shop anymore. I'm a literary agent. And, Colleen McCullough helped me become a literary agent." So I gave her my 30 pages.
Yeah.
And then 5 months or 6 months later, she rings me up and said, "I've just sold your 30 pages to Pam Macmillan." James Fraser walked in. He decided he was a fabulous publisher. And James figured it was time we were telling Australian stories. And so let's go back. We haven't had a really big Australian blockbuster since Thornbirds. So he just saw it. So they then said, "Okay, here's $5,000. You've got, 15 months. Go write it, turn it into a book." And I went, all my Christmases come at once. But then it was an absolute nightmare. So I moved. I didn't have very much money. I moved to Byron Bay. Someone told me about this hippie, quiet place called Byron Bay, and there are a lot of film people and quaint people up there. So I rented this shack off. Now a multi-millionaire, this old footballer called Tom Mooney, who had a shack at the bottom of his property. And he said, "Oh, you can stay in that." And so I had this little tiny writing shack, and I actually ended up staying there for 9 years and wrote 9 books eventually. Byron was, a whole other lifestyle. That was Byron in its heyday, really. Changed a lot now. So, and then I was really lucky that the book, because of this new interest in and being promoted, because I had a name. But I mean, even so, I think the subject matter, and that we're now launching an Australian stories again, people were ready for it. So the book really works. So then, I mean, I still had an awful time. It took me 18 months and it was a nightmare. The $5,000 ran out. But anyway, I lived on the mangoes in the backyard and the avocados. And then they said, "Oh, well, this is terrific. The book has worked really well." So I said, "Now for my second book," what I was thinking, I didn't even sort of think, "Oh, I have to wait to be asked, do they want another book?" I mean, in my enthusiasm, I just kind of said, "Oh, I have 1,000,000 stories." So they just kind of let me go. And here we are with 30 books.
Kudos to you. That's no small achievement. And look, okay, I mean, there's a degree of timing there, but in any success in anything that either myself or my family have got, there's a couple of times, without explaining the full context, where people have said to us, "Oh, you're lucky." And okay, you got to concede that there's
luck.
There's an aspect of timing, and
timing is crucial.
Timing is crucial, but it's like, if you don't have good product, if you haven't, if it wouldn't matter whether or not everybody was like craving for an Australian story and you wrote a terrible Australian story, no one would have bought that book. So
no, people didn't like it. It wouldn't have worked. And someone said to me, "If the book hadn't worked or didn't work, what would you have done?" And would you go back to television? What would you have done? And I said, "Well, just sit down and write another one."
Yeah, because it's what I wanted to do. So, that's skill and determination. I really, it's very Australian to be self-depreciating. We do get that from the English. There's nothing wrong with recognising that you've it was a magnificent achievement.
Well, it's more than just recognising a talent, because it's just that really that you just desperately want to do. I mean, when you have a passion for something, that's what you want to do. I mean, I've got friends that are artists and painters, and they splash away at the canvas for days and hours, and then they turn it around and they start again, and it's just this. It is rather obsessive, I do have to say, but I have great admiration for authors that they're struggling young mums and families, or they've got full-time high pressure jobs, and to go home at night or first thing in the morning to sit down and then do what they really want to do away from being an accountant or a whatever. That's, you've really got to have, if you don't have that much passion, then you're only kind of playing at it.
Yeah. You like the idea of writing. You don't like writing.
Yeah.
Like
yeah.
it's the same with anything. It's the same.
You know,
Again,
but mind you, Matt, I don't know that I'd want to be starting out now. It's the industry has changed a lot. It's very competitive. I mean, it's always been competitive, but the pricing now, like the cost of paper has just gone up enormously. The financial things, the selling now, you're competing with all of this stuff online, and there's so much other stuff. It's not quite the sort of gentleman's business, in the old-fashioned way of, and had a wonderful staff of editors, and it's got to be a streamlined business, hard-nosed business these days. Those sort of romantic old days have rather gone.
Let's talk about Australian identity. Now, your books are really Australian, but I get the feeling, that you describe our country with almost an outsider's eye. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that you're not an Australian and you don't have a deep love of the place, but that's the kind of feel that I get when I read your book. That's
interesting you pick that up. Well, as I told you, I left Australia as a young journalist to go to London. And while I lived in London for 4 years, I had gone by sea, as one did on the big old boats, on the ship going to Europe, and then I was going on to London to become, a journalist. I met a handsome American fellow who'd been in the Peace Corps. Kennedy had started, the Peace Corps volunteers, and he'd been in Sumatra, and he'd come to Sydney, looked around and got on the boat. So we had 6 weeks of intense conversation. That's all it was, because the boat was full of these wonderful elderly Maltese and Italian immigrants, sort of all going home to die, going back to the old.
Very, very.
So it was very jet set on board, and I was sharing a cabin with 5 old ladies. But Peter, we exchanged a lot of stories, and so after my 4 years in London, I got a postcard from Peter to say that he was in Singapore, and he'd been in Vietnam and he was in Singapore. And I said, I'm about to fly home, because no phones. This is all over several weeks of a postcard communications. And I said, I'm flying through Singapore on such and such a date. Can we meet? So we met, and we had dinner, which lasted 2 weeks. And I came home with an emerald engagement ring, and Peter flew down a few months later, and we got married, and then we flew off to America because he was in the diplomatic corps. But because I wasn't an American citizen, we had to wait 3 years. So we waited terrible time in Hawaii for 3 years while I became a citizen. And I worked in television as well in Hawaii, and my daughter was born there. And then we traveled. We moved country every 2 years, and we went to hardship posts, which he was a Southeast Asian expert. But we also went to Guyana. We were there when Jonestown happened. All through Asia. We lived in many, many countries. So by the time we did finally end up getting divorced, but that was really my issue, because what I was getting frustrated then, he got up the ranks and was important and had kids organized, and then it was like, when is it going to be my turn to go back and write the great Australian novel I've always been wanting to do? So we separated, and it was very amicable, as much as these things can be. And I came back to Australia, and then I thought, no, I have no money, I have to have a job. So breakfast television was starting, and I thought, now there's a good job, because I loved Good Morning America. I was familiar with it, and it hadn't been done here yet. And so I thought, this is a great job. You go in there at 3 a.m., you go on air at 7 a.m., it's all live television, it finishes at 9, you have a little meeting, and at 10 o'clock you go home, and you spend the rest of the day writing the great Australian novel. So, of course, the only job that was left was the entertainment reporter. So I was presenter and a reporter, doing interviewing movie stars and traveling and having to see movies in theatre and And like I was getting home at 10 o'clock at night to get up again at 3. Well,
Yeah.
after 8 years, that was when I decided that, if it was now or never. But at the same time, during that time, I also started doing film stories around Australia. So that was when, like, I met with R.M. Williams. So that was when I got the sense of my own country, because I'd been an outsider for so many years, and I'd never traveled in my own country. I was, I had lived in a very small little circle of journalists in Sydney and family, and that was it. And the grandparents who lived up here in the Manning Valley, where I now live, I didn't travel. I didn't have money. I'd heard of this glamorous place called Surfers Paradise that rich people went to, but so then when I came back, I realized that, and having lived abroad for so many years, you look at your own country through different cultural eyes, and you make comparisons, and you've seen the best and the worst in some countries. And then I realized that there was a complacency or an unawareness. We were very much an island. So I felt so I wanted to explore some of those things. So a lot of people say to me when they read my books, they feel they've been to the place, but they also learn something. I mean, I'm not preaching or anything, but I think that's, people seem to like that. They armchair travel with my books, or they, have come to look at things through different eyes.
Staying on the identity idea, you often have allusions to the classics, including the Greeks, which is something that I love. I think we're both of the opinion that Australia needs to forge its own literary identity. But does that require breaking ties with the classics, like the old world, its stories, its symbols?
Read everything.
Yeah.
Read everything from everywhere. But what I think one of the life-changing books that I have written was The Songmaster. I'd always had, a connection through my grandparents and the Indigenous people that live around here. My grandmother worked with them and sort of was part of, through the CWA, bringing them into the community as they were like what we used to call fringe dwellers at that time. This is going back in the 50s and the 60s, and so my grandmother always used to talk, about there was this rich culture and these really interesting people that weren't embraced in the community. But I had a wonderful woman friend. I did a film story on her in Broome, and for Good Morning Australia. And so, what is it now? It was 9-10 years later from when I'd last been in touch with her. And I'm walking out of a shopping centre in the Gold Coast, and she walks past me, and we go, Susan Di, whoa, I said, what are you doing here? And she said, I'm on my way back to Darwin, and they stopped at Coolangatta. I had 2 hours, so I thought I'd shop. And so we went and had a coffee, and she's always been she's really known as the Queen of the Kimberley, because she was a pastoralist. She ran stations on her own, and her husband was the flying vet. She was subsequently divorced, and she's running these massive 1 million acre stations that belong to the Meyer family as the manager there, a single woman, with all of the Aboriginal community. And so, and she said, I said, so what are you doing? And she said, the senior elder, Moljali, has asked me, it's time now, this is in the early 90s, that it's time that white and black Australians sit down and talk together how we go forward together. And so he has asked me to bring a bunch of good white fellas to sit out in his country for a couple of weeks with his elders, and we work out how we go forward together. And I went, good, how are you going to find those people, Susan? And she said, that's exactly what I said to Moljali. And Moljali said, don't you worry, Susan, they find you. So she said, you found me. That means you have to come. So a week later, I was on a plane to Broome and spent this extraordinary time with the Narranian. It was you know, it was life-changing. And so anyway, I wrote a book basically based on the experiences up in the Songmaster was based on those experiences. At the end of it, what did come out of that was that we decided, because there was one guy was a lawyer, and some were high achievers and some were university people, and then there was some just Joe Blow good blokes that, you know, drove trucks or whatever. So it was a little bit of a cross section of I think there were about 10 of us, 12 of us. And what do we do at the end of this extraordinary time? And I think some of the people thought, here we are coming to help them, and, you know, how we can all, move forward together, and we'll tell you how you can join white society and so on, when it was the most unbelievable time of renewing, of humbling learning, to just realize how little we know of this richness and this history and this culture and knowledge. It's just being ignored. So what we decided to do was we had also had the Archbishop of Perth with us, lovely Peter Carnley, and Peter suggested that he could use the church. We should exchange views. So we would bring kids from the Kimberley, Indigenous kids from the Kimberley, down to go to a really good school in Perth, and Perth kids would go, we would have these exchange, and we called it Bush University. And for a number of years, it was extraordinary. It was building up to being, I mean, I would still love to see Bush universities happening everywhere. But then Moljali was this charismatic, amazing elder. And when he died a couple of years later, it became a kind of touristy thing. But then the elders wouldn't turn up, and they're old. And without that kind of motivating force, it just kind of all dwindled off. And these kids that had been given a really great start ended up getting into trouble, getting on drugs. There was no guidance. And some of them went back to the bush. Some, some have been okay, but it was such a lost opportunity, so that became the sort of the core of the of the Songmaster. And then I said to Susan, I saw her a couple of weeks ago, and I said, you know what, I think I should write a sequel to the Songmaster. And she said, oh, don't, it's just too much of a tragedy. I just can't bear it. So, isn't it sad that we've gone backwards?
Are you willing to talk about your recent health scare?
Oh, well, it was, shock. Yes, I went, COVID. I mean, I'm a really pretty healthy person, and I've never had, I used to lay on Mona Vale Beach when I was a teenager, covered in coconut oil and sunbake, and lived in all these different countries. I've never had an issue with my skin or my, anything major with my health or whatever. And COVID, I've been in the house for 2 years, haven't been to a hairdresser for 2 years, but I thought I had to go up to Port Macquarie, an hour away, and I thought, I'm going to have a facial while I'm up there. I'm going to treat myself to a facial. And so the beauty therapist that was in there had never seen me before, and I had a kind of a brown stain that was like a birthmark that I've had for years. And she said, oh, have you ever had that checked? And I said, oh, yes, I had it lasered off 10 years ago or whatever. There's nothing to worry about. And she went, oh, but there's a little black spot in the middle of it. I said, oh, is there? Anyway, I didn't take notice, and I thought about that for a week. And then when I looked in the mirror, one paw, pinhead, was black. And I thought, ooh, they say black's not good. And so 2 weeks later, I went and got it checked, and the wonderful, skin doctor lady said, oh, we might just do a little biopsy on that. And I had like the worst kind of melanoma you can get. And 2 weeks later, I'm down in Sydney, and I had half, all from under here, all the way down here, just cut off. Well, first of all, I had a hole the size of an egg in my cheek to get all the cancer. And this is the terrifying thing, from that little pinhole, she said it's like an octopus, and the legs spread under the skin. So they had to cut this huge hole, and then to cover it up. He does this wonderful plastic surgeon. And then that was in December. And I mean, really, you can't see much, can you? I
No.
think it's fabulous. So so that's why I went public with it, to get everybody else to get checks.
Well, is there anything that you'd like to add? Is there anything,
No, new book coming out in September. It'll be out in September.